You think you understand medieval warfare. You think you've seen brutal combat in movies, read about it in books, maybe even studied it in history class. You think you know what terror looks like. You're about to discover just how catastrophically wrong you are. The Crusader raids of the 13th century weren't just military operations. They were systematic campaigns of psychological destruction so effective, so utterly terrifying, that entire populations would abandon their homes at the mere rumour of approaching Christian warriors. In Lebanon, archaeologists uncovered 2 mass graves containing 25 Crusader skeletons from the 13th century. Every single skeleton bore unhealed wounds from stabbing, slicing, and blunt force trauma. Most injuries were to the fighters' backs, suggesting they were cut down while fleeing. But here's what makes this discovery truly chilling. These weren't just battlefield casualties. The wound patterns reveal something far more sinister about how Crusader warfare actually functioned. The bones show evidence of systematic execution. Sword wounds across the backs of necks indicate prisoners were beheaded after battles ended. Others display trauma, suggesting they were attacked from behind by mounted warriors, likely during organized pursuit of fleeing civilians. This wasn't combat, this was hunting human beings for sport. And this was standard operating procedure for Crusader forces throughout the Holy Land. But the real terror of Crusader raids wasn't just their battlefield effectiveness. It was their strategic use of psychological warfare that turned entire regions into landscapes of fear. Medieval chroniclers describe something that sounds almost impossible to modern minds. Entire cities would empty at news of approaching Crusader armies, not because of military necessity, but because the reputation for systematic brutality preceded these forces like a plague. The Crusader raid strategy was devastatingly simple and horrifically effective. Strike without warning, maximize civilian casualties, leave survivors traumatized enough to spread terror, then disappear before organized resistance could respond. This wasn't random violence. It was calculated psychological warfare designed to break the will of entire populations through concentrated doses of terror. Contemporary accounts describe Crusader forces appearing seemingly from nowhere, moving with mechanical precision through towns and villages. They weren't just stealing supplies or capturing territory. They were conducting what modern military analysts would recognize as systematic terror campaigns. The goal wasn't just tactical victory, it was to create such profound psychological damage that resistance would crumble before battles even began. The effectiveness was terrifying. Muslim chroniclers describe panic spreading faster than the Crusader armies themselves. Reports of approaching Christian forces would cause mass evacuations, economic collapse, and social breakdown across entire regions. The mere possibility of a Crusader raid became as destructive as the raids themselves. This is psychological warfare at its most sophisticated and brutal. Medieval siege tactics reveal the true scope of Crusader brutality. When direct assault proved difficult, Crusader commanders routinely sanctioned firing diseased corpses of animals and humans into enemy fortifications. This wasn't desperate improvisation. It was standard procedure designed to spread disease, demoralize defenders, and create conditions where surrender became preferable to slow death by plague. The siege of fortified cities became laboratories for testing new methods of psychological destruction. Crusader engineers would undermine walls not just for tactical advantage, but to create spectacular collapses that would terrorize other cities into submission. The message was clear. Resistance meant not just death, but death preceded by prolonged suffering and humiliation. But perhaps most horrifying of all was how Crusader raids transformed the warriors themselves. Archaeological evidence and contemporary accounts reveal something that challenges every romantic notion about medieval chivalry. These weren't knights bound by codes of honor. They were men systematically conditioned for violence who found religious justification for acts that would have been considered war crimes even by medieval standards. The historian Guibert recorded the attitude of returning Crusader warriors with chilling accuracy. Because they had seen Jerusalem and the Holy Sepulchre, they believed they could thenceforth safely commit any crime. This wasn't battlefield psychology or temporary madness. This was systematic moral transformation where religious pilgrimage became justification for unlimited brutality. The psychological conditioning was as sophisticated as it was effective. Crusader forces operated under religious frameworks that transformed murder into holy duty, rape into divine punishment, and theft into righteous redistribution. Every act of violence became not just permissible but spiritually beneficial. This created warriors who could commit atrocities without psychological damage because they genuinely believed their actions served God. The scale of destruction reveals the true effectiveness of these psychological warfare tactics. The Holy Land during the Crusades experienced unprecedented levels of criminality and violence, more so than any other medieval war zone. This wasn't accidental. It was the predictable result of systematic terror campaigns designed to break civilian morale and destroy organized resistance. Crusader raid tactics evolved with terrifying efficiency. Early raids focused on material objectives like supplies and territory. But commanders quickly realized that psychological objectives were far more valuable. A single spectacular atrocity could terrorize 10 cities. A reputation for systematic brutality could clear entire regions without firing a shot. Terror became the most cost-effective weapon in the Crusader arsenal. The targeting of civilian populations wasn't collateral damage, it was strategic doctrine. Crusader forces specifically targeted non-combatants because killing soldiers only affected military capacity. Killing civilians affected entire societies. Women, children, elderly, religious figures, anyone who represented social stability, became priority targets not in spite of their non-combatant status, but because of it. Contemporary Muslim accounts describe something that sounds almost supernatural. Crusader forces moving through countryside like supernatural predators, appearing without warning, striking with mechanical precision, then vanishing before effective response could be organized. This wasn't luck or superior tactics. This was systematic application of terror warfare principles that wouldn't be formally codified by military theorists for centuries. The psychological impact extended far beyond immediate victims. Entire generations grew up under the constant threat of Crusader raids. Children were raised with stories of Christian atrocities. Social structures adapted to accommodate constant fear. Economic systems developed around the assumption that normal life could be interrupted by systematic violence at any moment. The Crusader raids didn't just kill people, they transformed entire civilizations around the reality of living under persistent terror. But we're only beginning to understand the true scope of what made these raids so absolutely terrifying. The logistics alone reveal the industrial scale of terror these raids represented. Crusader commanders didn't just organize military expeditions, they created systematic machinery for processing human suffering. Supply chains were established not just for weapons and food, but for managing captives, disposing of bodies, and extracting maximum psychological value from every act of violence. Archaeological evidence from multiple sites reveals something that challenges every assumption about medieval warfare limitations. Crusader forces operated with coordination and planning that rivaled modern military organizations. Raid routes were mapped months in advance. Intelligence networks identified high-value psychological targets. Communication systems ensured that news of atrocities spread faster than the armies themselves. The execution was methodical and terrifying. Crusader raid forces typically divided into specialized units with specific terror objectives. Advanced scouts identified civilian population centers and escape routes. Shock troops conducted the initial assault designed for maximum visible brutality. Pursuit units tracked down fleeing survivors to ensure word of atrocities reached neighboring communities. Cleanup crews disposed of evidence while maximizing psychological impact of remaining destruction. But here's what makes this truly horrifying for anyone who thinks medieval warfare was primitive or disorganized. These raids incorporated psychological warfare principles that modern military academies would recognize as sophisticated terror doctrine. Every element was calculated for maximum psychological impact per unit of military effort expended. The timing of raids reveals their true strategic sophistication. Crusader commanders specifically targeted religious festivals, market days, and harvest seasons when civilian populations were most concentrated and psychologically vulnerable. The goal wasn't just killing people, it was destroying social cohesion at moments when communities were most dependent on collective solidarity. Contemporary accounts describe Crusader forces using what modern psychologists would recognize as systematic torture techniques, designed not for information extraction, but for psychological warfare. Public executions were choreographed for maximum terror value. Methods of killing were selected specifically for their ability to traumatize witnesses. Even the disposal of bodies was weaponized to create lasting psychological damage in surviving populations. The religious justification made everything infinitely worse. Crusader warriors weren't just following military orders. They genuinely believed their acts of terror served divine purposes. This created combatants who could commit atrocities with psychological immunity because they viewed extreme violence as spiritual duty. The combination of military training with religious fanaticism produced warriors whose capacity for brutality exceeded even their contemporary Muslim enemies. Medieval chroniclers describe something that sounds almost impossible. Crusader raid forces operating with such systematic brutality that even hardened medieval warriors from other armies were shocked by their methods. These weren't men driven to desperation by impossible circumstances. These were systematically conditioned killers operating under religious frameworks that transformed every conceivable act of violence into holy duty. The scale of psychological conditioning reveals the true scope of what Crusader raids represented. Training programs systematically desensitized warriors to human suffering while simultaneously providing religious justification for unlimited brutality. Young men entered these programs as normal medieval soldiers. They emerged as something fundamentally different. Human beings whose capacity for violence had been systematically enhanced and morally justified to degrees that would horrify modern special forces operators. The aftermath of raids reveals their true strategic purpose. Crusader forces didn't just kill people and steal supplies. They systematically destroyed everything that made normal life possible. Wells were poisoned, crops were burned, religious sites were desecrated, social leaders were specifically targeted for public execution. The goal was creating a psychological wastelands where survivor communities could never fully recover. But perhaps most terrifying of all was how these raids transformed entire regions into landscapes of perpetual fear. The mere possibility of Crusader attack became as destructive as actual raids. Economic systems collapsed as trade became too dangerous. Agricultural production declined as farmers abandoned exposed territories. Social structures disintegrated as communities dispersed to avoid concentrated targets. The psychological warfare was so effective that it became self-perpetuating. Survivors of Crusader raids became living propaganda weapons, spreading detailed accounts of atrocities that terrorized populations far beyond the reach of actual Crusader armies. Every survivor story reinforced the reputation for systematic brutality that made future raids even more psychologically devastating. Contemporary Muslim military manuals from the period reveal something that should chill modern readers. Detailed instructions for how Islamic commanders should respond to Crusader psychological warfare tactics. These weren't just military documents, they were survival guides for dealing with an enemy whose methods of warfare transcended normal concepts of military engagement. The documentation reveals that Crusader raid tactics were so systematically brutal that they forced fundamental changes in how their enemies understood warfare itself. Traditional medieval concepts of honourable combat became irrelevant when facing opponents who viewed terror as their primary weapon. Entire military cultures adapted around the reality of fighting enemies who had systematically weaponized human suffering. Archaeological evidence continues revealing new horrors about how these raids actually functioned. Mass graves showing evidence of systematic torture, burned settlements with remains suggesting deliberate targeting of non-combatants, weapon modifications designed specifically for maximizing suffering rather than achieving quick kills. Every new discovery reinforces the same terrifying conclusion. Crusader raids weren't just military operations that happened to be brutal. They were systematic terror campaigns where military effectiveness was measured by psychological destruction achieved per unit of effort expended. The warriors who conducted these raids had been systematically transformed into something that medieval society had never seen before. Human beings whose capacity for violence had been enhanced and morally justified to degrees that made them effectively unstoppable instruments of terror. And the most terrifying part? This was just the beginning of what Crusader warfare would become. So the next time you see a movie depicting Crusader knights as noble warriors on holy quests, remember what we've uncovered here. Remember the mass graves filled with executed prisoners. Remember the systematic psychological warfare that transformed entire civilizations around perpetual terror. Remember the religious fanaticism that turned ordinary men into instruments of calculated brutality that would horrify modern war criminals. The Crusader raids weren't aberrations or desperate measures. They were the logical result of combining medieval military capability with religious justification for unlimited violence. They represent what happens when systematic terror becomes military doctrine and human suffering becomes weaponized for strategic advantage. These weren't the actions of a few rogue commanders or the unfortunate results of medieval warfare's inherent brutality. This was organized, systematic, religiously justified terrorism conducted by forces whose capacity for violence had been systematically enhanced beyond anything their enemies could effectively counter. The archaeological evidence doesn't lie. The contemporary accounts from both sides don't lie. The Crusader raids of the 13th century represent one of history's most effective and terrifying applications of psychological warfare. They created landscapes of fear so profound that their effects shaped entire civilizations for generations. And that should terrify anyone who thinks they understand what human beings are capable of when convinced their violence serves divine purposes. The Crusader raids reveal a truth about organized brutality that remains relevant today. When systematic terror becomes religious duty, there are no limits to the horrors ordinary people will commit.